It was a Friday night when Sarah and her friends, Aaron, Emily, and Mark, decided they desperately needed a break. Each of them was suffocating under the weight of their own demons. Sarah was drowning in late nights at the office. Aaron was buried under student debt. Emily was haunted by the recent loss of her parents, and Mark was clawing his way out of the ashes of a failed relationship. The idea of retreating to a secluded cabin deep in the woods seemed like the perfect antidote. The listing had been obscure, almost too good to be true. Sarah had stumbled across it late one night while doom-scrolling at work. A hidden gem, it promised. Rustic and remote, far from the noise of the world. The photos showed a charming, albeit slightly weathered, cabin surrounded by towering trees. A bargain price sealed the deal. Within minutes, her friends were on board. A weekend away, no phones, no emails, no responsibilities, felt like a lifeline. By the time they left Sarah's apartment and piled into Aaron's beat-up SUV, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting the city in shadows. Laughter and road trip banter filled the car, but as they drove farther from civilization, the mood shifted. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then dirt. The GPS signal faltered, the device stuttering as it struggled to find its way. Towering trees crowded closer to the narrow road, their skeletal branches reaching out like claws. When they finally arrived, the cabin sat hunched in the clearing like something that had been forgotten. Its sagging roof and peeling paint whispered of neglect. The windows, dark and lifeless, stared back at them like empty eye sockets. The clearing was utterly still, the surrounding forest unnervingly silent. "Cozy," Aaron joked, though his voice wavered. No one laughed. The interior was no better. Dust motes swirled in the weak beams of their flashlights. The floorboards groaned underfoot, and the air smelled stale, as though it hadn't been disturbed in years. The furniture was sparse and mismatched: an old rocking chair, a warped dining table, a couch with fabric so worn it was threadbare. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, its blackened interior yawning like an open mouth. They unpacked in silence, the earlier excitement replaced by a quiet unease none of them wanted to voice. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't welcome, that the cabin was waiting for something. Inside the cabin, their initial excitement was dampened by the oppressive silence that seemed to hang in the air. The floorboards groaned under their weight as they explored, each creak and groan echoing through the stillness. Dust motes floated in the dim light filtering through the grime-covered windows, giving everything a hazy, dreamlike quality. The living room was cramped and cold, dominated by a massive stone fireplace that looked as though it hadn't seen a fire in decades. Above the mantel hung an old, rusted horseshoe and a cracked mirror that distorted their reflections. Sarah shivered as she caught a glimpse of herself in the warped glass. It made her face look stretched and unfamiliar. "Rustic, huh?" Aaron muttered, running his hand along a sagging couch that let out a puff of dust. He sneezed violently. "This place is more like abandoned than rustic." Emily peered into the kitchen, where an ancient refrigerator hummed weakly, its yellowing surface spotted with rust. A single light bulb flickered above the cracked tile counter, casting eerie shadows over the warped wooden cabinets. The sink was deep and stained with rust, and a faded dish towel lay balled up on the counter like it had been hastily dropped there and forgotten. "It's like stepping into the 70s, she said, her voice uncertain. She opened a cabinet and found a few mismatched plates and cups, all coated in a fine layer of dust. "I'll clean these up so we can use them, I guess." Mark, meanwhile, had wandered upstairs. The staircase groaned loudly with every step, and the railing felt wobbly under his grip. He found 3 small bedrooms, each with a narrow bed pushed into a corner. The beds were dressed with worn, floral-patterned quilts that looked as old as the cabin itself. The closets were empty except for a few wire hangers and a faint, musty smell. "This is definitely some Texas Chainsaw Massacre kind of place," Mark said when he rejoined the group downstairs. "But hey, at least we've got beds." Sarah tried to shake off the unease. "It's fine," she said, forcing a smile. We'll make it work. Let's focus on dinner and the fire. Once we get settled in, this place will feel cozy. They divided tasks. Emily cleaned the dishes while Sarah and Aaron unpacked their food supplies. They had brought simple ingredients: hot dogs, canned beans, marshmallows, and a loaf of bread. Mark worked on building a fire in the stone fireplace. As the sound of wet sparks leapt into the air, frustration came across his face. This is impossible. The wood is useless. Mark crouched by the fireplace, frowning as he struck matches and nursed the flames until they finally fizzled into nothing. Accepting defeat, he decided that it would be best to try to build a campfire outside. It would also give the cabin time to air out. Finding a place outside, Mark gathered stones, dried sticks, and leaves. At first, the fire hissed and spat, but soon the warm glow spread across the yard, softening the harsh shadows and making the cabin feel a little less hostile. By the time the fire was roaring, dinner was ready. They gathered around the fire, sitting cross-legged on blankets. Aaron speared hot dogs on long forks and roasted them over the fire, while Emily ladled warm beans into mismatched bowls. "This is kind of fun," Emily said, her voice lighter now. "It's like camping, but with a roof over our heads." "Yeah," Sarah agreed, smiling despite the lingering unease in her chest. "It's not so bad." After dinner, they carried out the rest of their supplies: marshmallows, chocolate, and graham crackers for s'mores. The fire crackled brightly against the growing darkness, the sparks rising into the cool night air. The trees surrounding the clearing loomed tall and close, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. Beyond the firelight, the forest was an impenetrable wall of black. Aaron leaned back, staring up at the stars. "You don't get skies like this in the city," he said. "No light pollution, no noise. Just this." Emily smiled, toasting a marshmallow over the fire. "It's nice. Peaceful." Mark snorted. "Peaceful now, sure. Until Sarah starts spooking herself." "Me?" Sarah shot him a mock glare. "You're the one who watches every horror movie ever made. You're probably going to start freaking out the moment a raccoon rustles a bush." "I don't freak out," Mark said, smirking. But speaking of horror movies, he leaned forward, his face lit by the flickering flames. "Who's up for some ghost stories?" "Oh no," Emily groaned. "Do we have to?" "Come on," Mark said, grinning. "It's tradition. What's a campfire without ghost stories?" Sarah rolled her eyes but couldn't help smiling.
"Fine.
But keep it light. I don't want to be too scared to sleep tonight." Aaron smirked. "You're setting yourself up, Sarah." Mark began, his voice low and dramatic. "There's an old legend about these woods, you know. They say that a long time ago, a hermit lived out here, all by himself. He built a little cabin deep in the forest and barely ever left it. People in town said he was crazy, claimed he'd lost his mind after his wife and daughter disappeared." The fire crackled as he paused, letting the words sink in. "They said he went looking for them in the woods and never came back the same. Some folks swore they heard him calling for them in the dead of night, but others—" Mark leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Others said he found them, or what was left of them. And when he did, he lost whatever sanity he had left." The group sat in silence, the firelight flickering in their wide eyes. Sarah hugged her knees to her chest, glancing nervously over her shoulder at the dark woods. "What happened to him?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark grinned, his teeth gleaming in the firelight. "Depends on who you ask. Some say he went deeper into the woods and died out there. Others say he's still out there, watching, waiting. They call him the Whisperer because they say if you listen closely at night, you can hear him whispering through the trees." A gust of wind rustled the leaves, and Sarah flinched, her heart racing. "That's enough," she said, trying to sound firm. "You're just trying to freak us out." Mark shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "Believe what you want, but don't come crying to me if you hear something tonight." Aaron laughed, but it sounded nervous. Okay, enough creepy stories. Let's focus on the s'mores before we all lose our appetite." They fell into a strained silence, the firelight casting dancing shadows across their faces. But no matter how hard they tried to laugh and joke, the oppressive weight of the forest seemed to press in closer, the darkness watching from just beyond the reach of the firelight. After devouring the s'mores, they decided to explore before it got too dark. The woods were dense, oppressive, and alive with shadows that seemed to flicker just out of sight. As they pushed deeper, the trees seemed to close in, their gnarled branches twisting into grotesque shapes. Then they saw them, gravestones. The weathered markers jutted out of the earth like broken teeth, their inscriptions eroded by time. No names, no dates, just the faint outlines of forgotten lives. There were no paths, no signs of any nearby buildings. Just graves, swallowed by the forest. They hurried back to the cabin, their earlier jokes about ghost stories replaced by tense silence and nervous glances over their shoulders. The firelight flickered weakly against the encroaching darkness, and the forest felt alive around them. Shadows stretched unnaturally, and the rustling of the leaves seemed almost purposeful, as though something unseen followed just out of sight. Running towards the cabin, everyone filed in as Mark quickly slammed the door shut behind them. The air inside felt stale, heavy with the scent of damp wood and something faintly metallic. The cabin taking on an oppressive darkness that pressed against the windows. Emily lit a lantern and set it on the coffee table, its pale glow barely reaching the corners of the room. The others huddled together, the silence between them thick with unease. Outside, the forest seemed to shift and breathe, the faintest sounds of twigs snapping or leaves crunching carried on the breeze. Then it started. At first, it was subtle, a faint sound above them, like the creak of wood shifting under some unseen weight. They all froze, their eyes darting upward. "Old cabins make noise," Aaron said quickly, though his voice wavered. "Probably just the wind or squirrels in the attic." But even as he said it, the sound came again, soft, deliberate. A faint scratching, like nails dragging across wood. Sarah clutched her arms tightly, her stomach knotting. "That's not the wind," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As the minutes passed, the noises grew louder. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, thudded softly from above, crossing from one side of the cabin to the other. Everyone sat frozen, their eyes fixed on the ceiling, their breathing shallow. "It's probably nothing," Aaron said again, but now his voice carried no conviction. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth doing little to chase away the chill that seemed to settle over the room. And then they heard it. Whispers. At first, they were barely perceptible, soft murmurs that blended with the faint rustle of the trees, like distant voices carried on the wind. But as the minutes crept by, the whispers swelled, growing sharper and more defined, until they seemed to fill the air around them. Sarah tilted her head, straining to hear. The words were jumbled, like a conversation taking place just out of reach. Her stomach churned, and a shiver ran down her spine as she realized something chilling. The whispers weren't coming from outside. They were coming from inside. The room fell deathly silent as they all listened. The whispers were everywhere, above them, behind them, even beneath the floorboards. Mark stood suddenly, his face pale and his eyes wide, fixed on the window. His breath came in shallow gasps. "What is it?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached out with a shaking hand and slowly pulled the curtain aside. Beyond the glass was nothing but the impenetrable blackness of the forest. "There's nothing out there," he muttered, though his voice trembled. "It's just dark." Then came the tapping. It started softly, like the hesitant knock of a child's hand against the walls. Tap, tap, tap. They all jumped, their heads whipping toward the sound. It came again, this time from the opposite wall. Tap, tap, tap. It spread, echoing around the cabin. The walls, the ceiling, even the windows. The taps grew louder, more insistent, like something was testing the barriers, searching for a way in. Emily clutched her knees to her chest, rocking slightly. Her face was pale, and her eyes were glazed with terror. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice breaking. Mark grabbed the flashlight, his jaw clenched. "We shouldn't have come here," he muttered under his breath. He stood and took a step toward the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the doorknob. "Mark, wait," Sarah hissed.
"Don't open it."
But Mark didn't stop. He yanked the door open, and the whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. The forest outside was still, too still, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Mark shone the flashlight into the darkness. The beam barely penetrated the oppressive black, illuminating only the nearest trees. "There's nothing," he said, his voice shaking. He stepped out onto the porch, the others crowding behind him. But then the flashlight flickered. "Mark." Emily's voice wavered, her grip tightening on Sarah's arm. The flashlight flickered again, then went out entirely. They were plunged into darkness. And that's when they heard it, a low, guttural sound, like a growl, coming from deep within the woods. The tapping resumed, faster now, louder. It surrounded them, hammering against the walls, the windows, even the roof. Something heavy scraped against the porch, and the growl came again, closer this time. Mark stumbled backward into the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it. The tapping turned to pounding fists or claws, slamming against the walls. "Turn the lights off," Aaron shouted, his voice cracking. Emily fumbled with the lantern, her hands shaking so badly it almost fell. The room plunged into darkness. They huddled together, their breaths ragged, as the pounding continued. Then came the whispering again, louder now, clear enough to make out words. "Let us in," the voices said, overlapping and echoing. "Let us in." Sarah buried her face in her hands, trembling. "This isn't happening," she whispered. Outside, the growling grew louder, joined by a series of guttural, inhuman shrieks that seemed to come from all directions. The walls shuddered under the relentless pounding, and for a horrifying moment, it felt as though the cabin itself would give way. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. Not a single sound came from outside. Not the wind, not the rustle of leaves, not even the distant call of an owl. They sat frozen, barely daring to breathe, as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, Mark spoke, his voice barely audible. "We can't stay here." No one argued. The silence was suffocating. Aaron grabbed the keys, his hands shaking as he fumbled to unlock the car. They piled in, slamming the doors behind them. As the engine roared to life, Sarah dared to glance back at the cabin. In the window, a figure stood, its face obscured but its outline unmistakable. It didn't move, didn't follow. It simply watched as they sped away. Aaron floored the gas pedal, the tires kicking up gravel as they sped away into the dark, winding forest road. No one spoke, the oppressive silence from the cabin still clinging to them. The headlights carved shaky paths through the trees, but the darkness beyond seemed to swallow everything else. Sarah gripped the dashboard, her knuckles white. Every shadow outside the car felt like it was moving, creeping, reaching. Emily sat frozen in the back seat, staring out of the rear window, her breath shallow and ragged. "Do you think it's following us?" she finally whispered. "Don't," Aaron snapped, his voice tight. "Don't talk about it." It wasn't until they hit the outskirts of a small town several miles away that Aaron finally eased his foot off the gas. The town was eerily quiet, the streets barren, as though the entire population had vanished. Storefronts were dark, and the only light came from a single flickering street lamp near an old motel with a neon sign that read vacancy, one of the letters dimmed and buzzing faintly. "This will do," Mark said, his voice hollow. They pulled into the gravel lot and parked. Sarah hesitated as they approached the office door, her stomach twisting with unease. Something about this place felt off, but they were desperate, and the motel clerk, though distracted and tired-looking, handed over a single key without question. Inside the room, the harsh fluorescent light did little to ease Sarah's nerves. The space was simple, 2 double beds, a small desk, and a bathroom. It was clean, but there was something unsettling in its sterile perfection. The walls were devoid of any decoration, the window covered with heavy curtains that refused to let in the faintest sliver of moonlight. Sarah lingered by the door for a moment as the others settled in. She couldn't shake the nagging sense of familiarity, as if she'd been here before. "You okay?" Mark asked, dropping onto the edge of the bed. "Yeah," Sarah lied, brushing off the feeling. "Just tired." They all were. It wasn't long before they each claimed a bed and drifted off, the events of the night leaving them emotionally drained. But sleep didn't come easy for Sarah. She kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see a faint outline of a hand pressed against the glass. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of the bed or the rustle of the sheets. Each sound sent a chill down her spine. She finally dozed off but awoke abruptly in the middle of the night. A soft tapping sound echoed through the room. Tap, tap, tap. Her breath hitched. At first, she thought it was coming from the wall, but as she strained to listen, the sound grew louder, more deliberate. She froze when she realized it wasn't the wall. It was coming from outside. Her heart thundered in her chest as she turned toward the window, her body stiff with dread. Slowly, she reached over and turned on the lamp. The warm light flooded the room, chasing away some of the shadows, but her fear didn't abate. "Hello," she called out softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The tapping stopped. For a moment, she thought she might have imagined it. But then it started again, this time from the ceiling. The rhythmic knock of the unseen force seemed to surround her, closing in from all directions. She felt the air grow heavier, thicker, pressing down on her chest. Then, something cold brushed against her throat. Sarah gasped, her body jerking upright as the invisible force wrapped around her neck. She tried to scream, but her voice came out strangled, as if the sound itself was being stolen from her. Her limbs refused to move, and panic clawed at her mind as the walls of the room seemed to close in, the once clean space distorting and shifting around her. She fought against it, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Finally, with a burst of sheer desperation, she stumbled out of the bed and toward the door. She fumbled with the lock, her hands trembling, until it finally gave way, and she tumbled into the courtyard outside. The cool night air hit her like a wave, but she barely noticed. She stood there, her chest heaving, as the few other motel guests peeked out of their doors, staring at her with wide, confused eyes. I can't stay here," she stammered, her voice barely audible. She didn't wait for questions. She turned and bolted for the car. As she sped away from the motel, her knuckles white against the steering wheel, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. From the rearview mirror, she thought she saw a figure standing in the courtyard, shrouded in darkness. Its form was indistinct, but its presence was suffocating. Whatever had followed them from the cabin wasn't done. It had found her again, and deep down, Sarah knew this was only the beginning.